David, a warm welcome to Sentientist Conversations. It's great to have the chance to talk to you.
It's great to be here, Jamie.
Cool. So this series of conversations are really about this modern recasting of sentientism that I'm trying to develop and popularize. And I summarize it saying it's about evidence, reason, and compassion. So in a way, it's just answering those two most fundamental questions: what's real and what matters to us morally. And that's really the center of the conversation I'd love to have with you today. But to get us started, for those that don't already know of you and your amazing body of work, how would you best introduce yourself and what you've focused on?
Right. Well, in 1995, I wrote an online manifesto called The Hedonistic Imperative, which, in spite of its rather debauched sounding title, is actually a plea to use biotechnology to phase out the biology of pain, misery throughout the living world, and to replace the biology of suffering with life based on gradients of intelligent bliss. And this is really important. It's not just humans that matter, it's all sentient beings. And thanks to biotechnology, it's going to be possible to reprogram the biosphere and get rid of suffering throughout the living world. So it's a combination, if you like, of compassion, very ancient Buddhist ethic. I'm personally more inclined to negative utilitarian, but it's very ancient ethic, but combined with compassion, this idea that, compassion alone is not enough. Essentially, we need to systematize our benevolence. And it's possible to be tremendously compassionate, to love cats and to love mice, but the only effect of caring for cats and caring for mice is to just see the cycle of suffering continue. Whereas if we're ethically serious about getting rid of suffering, I think we need to tackle its biological genetic roots. And this essentially has been the focus of my work, exploring the molecular genetic basis of pain and suffering, the nature of the hedonic treadmill. That's this suite of negative feedback mechanisms in the central nervous system that stop most of us being very happy or sad for very long. And exploring ways that it's going to essentially be possible to redesign reward architecture so that life can be based on information-sensitive gradients of bliss.
And those themes of your work have run through your philosophical writing, your involvement with the effective altruism community, and also your foundational role in the World Transhumanist movements as well. So,
back in 1998, Nick Bostrom, a young postgrad at the LSE, and I set up the World Transhumanist Association, which has been rebranded as Humanity Plus because the term transhumanism scares people. But what do transhumanists believe? Extraordinarily diverse movement, but can be encapsulated, if you like, in the three supers of super intelligence, super longevity, and super happiness. Now, I confess, when Nick suggested setting up something like this organization, I was a little bit skeptical at first because I associated transhumanism with extropianism, libertarianism, free market fundamentalism. But Nick had stumbled across Hedonistic Imperative back in 1997. Convinced me that I was a transhumanist. I'll be candid with you. Not all transhumanists give the problem of suffering, let alone the problem of non-human animals suffering, as much weight as the themes of radical life extension and superintelligence. And I'm very happy to talk about these themes. But most, though not all, transhumanists would sign up for the some version of the three supers. This is essentially the idea that it's going to be possible to replace the misery and squalor and stupidity and aging of Darwinian life with a kind of triple S civilization, and not least the possibility that everyday life could be sublime for all sentient.
I think we'll come back to some of those links, because one of the challenges that many people face when they look at the transhumanist movement is it seems to be focusing on the sort of utopian upside, but doesn't pay enough attention to the mitigation of suffering and so on. So I think we'll come back to that. But where I'd love to start is almost to roll it back to, I guess, your personal philosophical development as well. So the two central questions that sentientism is trying to answer starts with what's real. And for many people, that might be a religious or some sort of form of supernatural upbringing that then they develop or they move away from. How did that happen for you, the sort of epistemological side of your thinking, naturalism, religion, supernatural? How did you grow up, and did that shift over your life?
Yeah, I'm a third generation vegetarian or vegan. One of my ancestors cycled from one end of the British Isles to another on a penny farthing, which rather gives the lie to the idea that vegetarianism is a recipe for weakness. But I haven't maintained this tradition myself. But essentially, I come from quite a religious background. Quaker influences on both sides of the family. My father was a Quaker. My mother, rather more exotic, belonged to Order of the Cross, worship God the Father, Mother, vegetarian, quite a mystical strain of Christianity.
And is that something you adopted as a child, or?
I mean, I lost my religious faith, or rather ceased to believe in God, round about the age of 10 or 11. I mean, I have no natural sense of spirituality. I recall going to Quaker meeting aged 7 or 8 and just waiting to see if God would deign to communicate with me. Never did. I won't claim that I've never had any kind of spiritual experience, but it's sort of last century drug catalyzed. But nonetheless, I have from a pretty early age been a secular scientific rationalist. But at the same time, I clearly have been influenced by the ethical views of my parents and grandparents, essentially an ethic of compassion.
Yeah. And did that feel like quite an easy thing to give up, or was it, difficult? Because I came from it was a very simple process of moving away from that. Whereas some of the other people I've interviewed, grew up in households where religion was absolutely central to their identity. And it was actually very, traumatic and difficult to try and move to a naturalistic worldview and be open with their families about that.
Because God had never played a really significant role in my life. I mean, for some people, God is as real as chairs and tables. But as far as I can recall, my ancestral namesake, aged 8 or 9, God didn't loom especially large. Mm-hmm. I cringe in retrospect at some of the insensitive, secular, rationalist, skeptical things I said as a teenager to my parents, but no, there wasn't some kind of traumatic break. I just didn't see any evidence of a creator.
That's simple. And you mentioned that theme of compassion that runs through much religious thinking in many religions, and as you said, has ancient roots. If you go back to Jain or Buddhist or African philosophies, that theme of compassion runs through. And most people who've come to a naturalistic way of thinking have adopted or kept that compassion, and I'd argue that compassionate thinking actually predates all religions. The reason it's in all of those religions is because it predates them, and arguably there's some form of rudimentary ethics or morality that was even pre-human that we've as part of the evolutionary baggage that we've brought along, right? So there's enormous value in that religious that stream of religious thinking. But one reason many people are scared about giving up a supernatural or a religious worldview is because they think they will lose their moral foundations, because without a perfect God that decides what is right and wrong, and without that judgment hanging over you and potentially punishment after your death, they're nervous that morality disappears completely because you have no objective judgment. So they either double down and stick with the somewhat arbitrary supernatural version of ethics and morality, or they go in another direction I think is deeply insidious and damaging, which is a sort of purely relativistic approach, which says no grounding to morality, it's just what we negotiate. So if a group of people in Iran decide it's moral to throw gay people off roofs, then who are we to judge, right? So those are two crazy extremes. given you don't have a supernatural basis for your ethics, how would you describe the foundation of your morality? And why should we care about anything or anybody else or anything else?
If one isn't religious, is morality in some sense like supporting your football team? I mean, I'm a fanatical Manchester United supporter. They are the greatest, but is it really as empty as that? Now, I'm now going to go off into some heavy-duty philosophy, but particularly when one is, let's say, discussing with people who eat meat, who don't share my suffering-based ethics, I don't start with some long metaphysical disquisition on the nature of value or anything. I think it's more fruitful to start with common ground in that almost everyone agrees that it is morally wrong to harm a small child, that child abuse is wrong. Yeah. And in order to get the whole abolitionist project off the ground, the idea that we should be phasing out biology of suffering, it's not necessary to go into a bunch of speculative metaphysics. One can just take what most people would regard as axiomatic, that child abuse, harming a toddler is wrong, and then go on to point out that non-human animals are akin to small toddlers, and take things from there. However, okay, I promised I would now go into a bit of philosophy. Yeah, I start from the idea that suffering by its very nature, first-person suffering, is self-intimatingly bad. That
almost by definition.
For reasons we do not understand, essentially agony and despair, it is built into their very nature that they are disvaluable. But sure, agony and despair are mind dependent, but essentially any theory of the world that hasn't got a place for agony and despair, it's like any theory of reality that has no place for color. Redness is a feature of reality. One can argue whether that physical objects are intrinsically colorful or not, but simply because agony and despair, i.e. disvaluable states like that, and mind dependent, is not an argument for anti-realism. So, okay, I know that my own agony and despair are self-intimatingly disvaluable, but I also know from natural science the so-called view from nowhere, that all here and nows are equally real. And thanks to evolution, our perception is systematically warped. I mean, I seem to be the center of reality, which, the hub of the cosmos that follows me around. My feelings, my experience seem to be central, and yet one knows from evolutionary biology, evolutionary psychology, that this is an extremely fitness-enhancing illusion, or we might say a delusion. And from this basic self-intimating fact that my agony and despair are bad, I then go on to generalize the fact that agony and despair are bad regardless of race or species or anything else.
I don't think I'm clever enough to do proper philosophy, but this is the sort of philosophy I like. In a way, suffering is bad because I don't like it, and I'm pretty sure you don't either. And I'm pretty sure that any other being that has a similar evolutionary past and a similar sentient architecture of information processing also doesn't like it. So it almost becomes tautological, which
yes, I mean,
but I think that's a foundation. So in a way, I'm not a moral realist in the sense that if there were no sentient beings in the universe, I don't think morality even makes sense. It doesn't exist at all. It's not floating out there in some platonic sense. But that doesn't mean my morality isn't grounded. It's grounded in, as you said, a naturalistic understanding.
Minds are a feature of reality. And if anyone is skeptical, I mean, this is it. One tends to listen to podcasts or watch a YouTube video in a relatively comfortable state. And just try, something like plunging your hand into ice cold water and holding it there. What is the nature of this disvaluable state? Yes, it's nasty, but it's for reasons we simply do not understand. Its disvaluable nature is self-intimating. And, of course, the moral anti-realist will say, well, look, sure, yeah, your suffering is disvaluable to you, but it's not disvaluable to me. But I would argue that this is an epistemological limitation on the part of the anti-realist. That I sometimes use the conjoined Hogan sisters, and they partially share a mind in virtue of a shared thalamic bridge. They can, to some extent, feel each other's feelings, hear each other's sounds, see each other's experiences. And there's a sense in which the Hogan sisters know something the rest of us don't. Or to use another example of mirror touch synesthetes. A mirror touch synesthete, if you tread on a pin, will undergo an intensely unpleasant experience himself or herself. That if one actually understood the nature of experience, the first person experience of other subjects, one would feel it as one's own, that it is simply ignorance that leads us to think that the suffering doesn't matter. So, yeah, I can imagine, and this is speculative, a future civilization in which mind melding via reversible thalamic bridges is routine, or maybe we become some kind of mega mind or something like that. And this kind of civilization, looking back at Darwinian humans trapped in our little solipsistic island universes, will think of us as fundamentally ignorant, not just behaving immorally, but ignorant in the sense of not realizing that we are subjects of experience, rather, as we tend to regard each other most of the time, objects that one speculates have feelings. So drawing the strands together, this self-intimating, disvaluable nature of my suffering, together with the scientific world picture that says there's nothing really special about me.
Yeah, it's almost like a Copernican worldview, right? Why should we be special? It's vanishingly unlikely that we're unique. And someone can, of course, say, well, I choose not to care about the suffering of others, but they are essentially choosing not to be moral. And you can do that, but the rest of us will hopefully constrain you. So
and I would say choosing not to be moral, but in some sense choosing to be irrational too. Imagine a kind of super psychopath who steals from their own pension fund because they don't care about their future selves. Is the super psychopath being incredibly rational and self-interested, or essentially being irrational?
Yeah, and I think that's part of the reason I've been trying to frame sentientism in this way, that binds together a naturalistic approach and a moral circle and ethical stance, because some people will insist that those things can be separate and should be separate. But to me, the ethical stance is actually grounded in a naturalistic understanding of what it means to be a sentient entity. So they lock together quite tightly and quite nicely. When the words, I didn't invent the word sentientism, of course, it was developed, I think it was first used in quite a derogatory sense by, I think, John Rodman in 1977 to describe what Peter Singer and Richard Ryder and others were doing, which was setting out a view of having a moral circle that was bounded by sentience, not by the human species. And Richard and Peter both developed it in quite an explicitly naturalistic way, but it was naturalistic in setting the moral circle. It didn't really talk more broadly about a naturalistic worldview. So, well, let's make it more broadly naturalistic in the same way as secular humanism is naturalistic about everything, as well as have this sentiocentric moral circle that defines. So it sort of links both together. But I find that quite compelling. Other people are more nervous about it and say, look, I want to have my epistemological view over here and my ethical moral view over here. And whether it's the sort of the is-ought nervousness that I think artificially forces those apart, or whether there's just cultural nervousness about the role of religion and freedom of belief. But I find it compelling to link the two.
Essentially, when one's talking about relativity of morality, one isn't talking about the idea that there are some civilizations that don't find agony and despair disvaluable. Rather, it's what philosophers call the different intentional objects. Intentionality is the aboutness of thought. So, this shared pleasure-pain axis, but for evolutionary and cultural reasons, pains and pleasures latch on to all kinds of intentional objects that in many cases were fitness enhancing in the ancestral environment.
So to you and you adopted a quite naturalistic worldview quite early on. So did I. I was, maybe a little older than you, but that now seems almost self-evident and quite solid to us. It's sometimes hard to imagine how someone could have a deeply supernatural worldview. And on the moral circle, again, you were lucky enough to be part of a family environment where that, I guess a moral circle included all sentient beings, or certainly non-human animals, was just assumed and built in from birth. It took me quite a few decades to crack through enough cognitive dissonance to adapt. So I think you and I probably feel both of those questions, the naturalism and the sentiocentrism, are pretty solid aspects of our thinking that it's almost hard to disagree with, viably. Yet nearly everybody on the planet does. So most of the 8 billion people on the planet have some form of supernatural or religious worldview. They genuinely believe a large number of things for which there is no good supporting evidence. And most people on the planet also have a very different moral circle that, to be honest, isn't really a circle. So people will have a moral circle that includes all humans but excludes some forms of sentient animal, but includes some others like companion animals or charismatic wildlife, but excludes the farmed animals and vermin and other wild animals. Others will have a moral circle that excludes certain parts of the human race as well. We have, you mentioned before, so much work still to do on human discriminations too, which again have no basis in fact. That conflict between having two stances that seem so self-evident and compelling, but nearly everybody disagrees with it, is deeply frustrating. But I guess it comes to these questions of social norms and indoctrination and social change. What do you have a sense as to why that disconnect is there? Because it would be good to get on to talking about how we see the future evolving and how quickly we might be able to make it happen. And
yes, my own approach is, rather than engage in philosophical, theological disputation, is to focus on what is best in the different religious traditions.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not always possible if someone says they're a Nietzschean or a neo-Nazi or something like that.
Yeah.
They just don't find enough in common. But if someone, for example, believes in an all-merciful, all-compassionate God, then, if it's a Christian, fundamentalist Christian, one focuses on Isaiah, the peaceable kingdom, the lion and the wolf that will lie down with the lamb. The Bible is light on the biotechnical details by which this transformation will happen. But yeah, rather than telling them, hey, one has this radically new ethical, theoretical, stress the continuities. And certainly if one is willing to grant that Allah or God is all merciful and all compassionate, and all merciful, all compassionate God has given us the tools of CRISPR or cultured meat development and so forth, then it doesn't take a lot to be able to claim that the religious and the secular perspective can dovetail.
Yeah.
But yeah, what follows from the existence of an all-merciful, all-compassionate God whose compassion is greater than any mortal? If mere mortals can envisage using technology to engineer the well-being of all sentients, surely God's compassion and greatness must be vaster. Once again, this is in a sense taking the religious theological perspective, some of its background assumptions, and seeing what follows from them. Because obviously, most religious people, just as compassionate as you or me, it's a matter of showing how they can harness this compassion within the context of their kind of conceptual scheme.
It's difficult. There's a risk, and you'll certainly see this within some of the atheist or free thinking or skeptic or humanist movements, to come across as quite arrogant and overconfident and almost scientistic in the worldview, and a little bit derogatory and a little bit preachy. And you can understand that, because I think you see a similar thing in some of the animal advocacy or the vegan movements, because once you've seen something is right and you're deeply convinced of it and is powerfully important in the world around you, it's very hard not to let that emotion and that confidence come through in the way you communicate. But I think that's an important element of, both humanism when it's done right, but also sentientism, is the compassion commitment isn't just compassion for people we agree with, it's compassion for people we disagree with. And if you genuinely take that compassionate approach seriously, I think that leads you to a much richer mode of engagement with people who have a supernatural or a religious worldview, because you can understand the context of where they've come from and why they have that worldview. You can see the value they see in it. You can accord them, serious rights and freedom to believe what they like. The intersection and the challenge is when those beliefs start to cause needless harm to others. And that's where I think you're right. You can link to the enormous common ground we have in that most people love their families. They feel a natural baseline level of compassion. Most people, even religious people, use evidence and reason in 95% of their lives on a daily basis as well. And if we can build on those common aspects and leave plenty of freedom for people to believe whatever they like, but we work on the compassion and the ethics and the harm, I think that's a much more powerful and compassionate way of progressing, rather than saying, you're wrong, we're right, please agree with me now immediately, which is never really going to work.
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, the Bible or the Quran or the ancient Sanskrit texts, they don't have any prohibitions against cultured meat or genetically engineered babies or anything like that. So, they can't quote chapter and verse against us. And also, scientific materialism, it's not as though scientific materialism has any explanation as to why there is something rather than nothing. Some scientific materialists even believe in the existence of a creator. This is the simulation hypothesis. Yeah. Nor has scientific materialism any explanation of the existence of consciousness or phenomenal binding or the causal capacity of consciousness to inspire discussions of its existence or the diversity of different states of consciousness. There are problems with orthodoxy too.
Yes.
So one needs to be a little humble, I think.
I totally agree, and I think that's part of the problem with that evidence and reason naturalistic worldview, is if that comes across as we have the facts, we have the answers, it becomes in a way its own dogma, when the very power of a scientific worldview should be to always be in doubt, never be 100% sure about anything outside of formal systems, always be open to new evidence, and to be comfortable not knowing. But sometimes the scientific world and the naturalistic worldview comes across as, you're stupid, we have the answers, here are the facts, the conversation is over. It's like, that's not the very power of a scientific worldview, is its ability to be open-minded and self-correct and slowly get less wrong over time. But that often doesn't come across from the righteousness and the preaching necessarily. One thing that will be interesting to cover, because it's important, one of the things I'm hoping to do with the sentientism idea is keep it as a very, very simple philosophical baseline. So it really is just naturalism and sentiocentrism. But that leaves an enormous world of potential disagreement out there. So it leaves potential for disagreement about ethical systems, about consequentialism and utilitarianism and deontology and virtue ethics and the different forms of utilitarianism and how you balance the negative and the positive aspects of sentientism. So you could go on and on and on. And in a way, sentientism deliberately sort of stays out of that and says, enjoy yourselves, work that out, but you have to include all sentient beings in your moral circle, and you have to take a naturalistic approach. But it's also true about the naturalism, because different people have different sets of evidence. We reason in different ways. There is no consensus on many of the topics, particularly the ones you talked about as well. So it's really important for me to make it very, very clear that most sentientists disagree with each other on almost everything. It's just those two sort of basic things that they have an agreement on. And one of the fascinating areas is actually central to sentientism, which is the nature of sentience itself and the nature of consciousness itself. And you've touched already on inability, or at least the lack of confidence that science has around the nature of consciousness. And I think you've got some fascinating views there that personally as an amateur I think I differ with, but it might be interesting
amateurs. This is a scandalous thing. Other things being equal, are the most useful skills one acquires in life is working out who the relevant experts are and then critically deferring to their expertise. But when it comes to consciousness, Honestly, the layperson is often as interesting as the distinguished professor of philosophy.
Because I tend to take a quite a sort of hard, basic materialist information processing line, where I just think that consciousness and sentience within that are classes of particularly rich, advanced information processing that happen to have evolved to help entities develop an advanced modeling of themselves in an environment. And this is just what it feels like to be running that information processing. And I know you don't find that satisfying. It's like it feels almost like it's missing the most important thing about consciousness. So it might be interesting to spend a couple of minutes on that. I know you've discussed it elsewhere, but
yeah, I mean, there are some fabulously complicated information processing system from, the stock market, the financial markets, or even the kind of the 500 million odd nerve cells of the kind of the enteric nervous system, the brain and the gut, that, to the best of our knowledge, are not unified subjects of experience, even if their individual components may have micro-experience or micro-qualia. Nonetheless, unless some form of animism or strong emergence is true, that, the stock market or the enteric nervous system or a termite colony or the population of the USA.
Eric Schwitzgebel has
Schwitzgebel, yes. Eric Schwitzgebel.
I think you shared the paper with me about, is the United States conscious? Yeah.
Yes. If materialism is true, the United States is probably conscious. But although one can't rule this out, I would say that if it's true, then some form of strong emergence is the case. And strong emergence is akin to magic. To make Eric Schwitzgebel's experiment more realistic, I sometimes ask people to imagine that the population of the USA agrees to take part in an experiment, and 330 million odd skull-bound American minds agree to implement any computation you like. And I would argue that if physicalism is true, all you've got is a micro-experiential zombie, that 330 million Americans each having a pinprick doesn't create a continental migraine, even if they signal to each other. So, I mean, just to lay my cards on the table, although I am as mystified in one sense by consciousness and reality as anyone else, I combine from, orthodox science physicalism. Physicalism is the idea that essentially all the special sciences reduce to physics, and the mathematical formalism of physics exhaustively describes everything that happens in the world. But here's the really weird bit. Of late, the so-called intrinsic nature argument has become more popular. This is the idea that the equations of physics are silent on the intrinsic nature of the physical. The fire in the equations. Intuitively, it's non-sentient, but the equations themselves are silent, and this sounds, I'm well aware to some people, completely crazy. If experience discloses the intrinsic nature of the physical, then the hard problem does not arise. And according to this problem, what makes the minds of biological animals special isn't consciousness per se, it's binding. And the sense that we are unified subjects of experience. And that falling dreamlessly asleep, what that does, it doesn't destroy consciousness, it destroys binding. Then you become effectively a micro-experiential zombie. This is speculative, and this is controversial stuff.
Yeah. But we need to be open to even crazy sounding ideas, because they have been proven to be true in the past. And Eric
Schwitzgebel, he also came up with this term crazyism. Whatever the true explanation is, it is going to be intuitively crazy. So I think a much better question to anyone with a crazy idea is not, just how absurd, but how do you test it?
In many ways, I'm interested in the ethical implications of the outcomes of these ways of thinking. We need to play them through. I have wound up Philip Goff occasionally by positing PowerPointism as an alternative to panpsychism, where you could look through the code of PowerPoint, and if you didn't understand code, you would have no idea how you can find align to center or snap to grid in the code. It just doesn't seem to be there. But you experience the wonder of PowerPoint in its full richness. You just don't understand how the two can relate, so that you posit that the spirit of PowerPoint is therefore fundamental to the entire universe, which is a not entirely fair comparison to consciousness. But I do get nervous that sometimes, whether it's quantum physics or consciousness or the origin of the universe, that there are areas of radical uncertainty where we really don't know the answers. And the human temptation to posit things for which there's no real basis, the woo, as some people describe it, sort of, and the magic and the mysticism creeps back in. It's like, oh, great, we found another reason to inject God or inject magic back in. So I think we need to find a balance between resisting that temptation, but at the same time, not just pushing aside crazy ideas because they're crazy, because they may well be true. So even with the panpsychists that will claim that in some sense, even a photon or an electron, there's some minimal level of consciousness awareness with any sort of information processing at that level, which I find struggle to understand because time doesn't even pass for a photon. So, in my mind, if we're going to say a photon is conscious, we've redefined the term consciousness to such a degree it no longer means anything. It's just everything is. But anyway, let's leave that one side. But even the people who do claim that an electron or photon could have some minimal level of consciousness, still, I think, wouldn't claim that they're necessarily sentient in the sense that they could be experience suffering or experience, a valence.
Even if consciousness is fundamental to the world, it's not like anything to be in a rock. And it's also worth distinguishing between panpsychism, this idea that consciousness is somehow attached to all fundamental entities, and what can be called non-materialist physicalism. This is the idea that experience discloses the intrinsic nature of the physical, because classical electrons, there is an electron field, but if we take quantum field theory seriously, one shouldn't have this 19th century view of little atomic billiard balls.
That's fascinating. So where I'd like to, I guess, close out now is thinking about the future. And you've already introduced some of the themes of your own thinking about where we could get to with a sort of unashamed direct use of technology and biology to, enhance a sort of utopian future for all sentient life. What's your thinking about how we'll be able to progress towards that? Because we have, super long-term visions that might sound quite sci-fi. We also have some immediate moral imperatives about the sheer scale of suffering that's happening day to day on the planet. How do you think things are going to evolve, both in, I guess, the slow changing of human values, given the level of indoctrination we're all subject to, the practical problems we're facing moment to moment and year to year, and that tension against the longer term future that you've laid out?
Yeah, well, let's start with humans. Although the first CRISPR babies in China were conceived in extremely unfortunate circumstances, nonetheless, essentially now that we have cracked our genetic source code, it's going to be increasingly feasible for all prospective parents to choose the genetic makeup of their offspring. And whereas this is first likely to be done to prevent various terrible genetic diseases that many, possibly even most people would support. Looking further ahead, I think we're going to see access to pre-implantation genetic screening, counselling, CRISPR genome editing, and essentially there's a lot of the focus and the controversy over designer babies focuses on the issue of intelligence. Will it be possible to choose to have exceptionally intelligent kids? At least as morally relevant, I think, is that it will be possible to choose the hedonic set point, hedonic range, and pain thresholds of your future children. And this, I think, is tremendously important. Although personally, I have an extraordinarily dark view of Darwinian life and suffering. I'm not convinced it's ethically justifiable to bring new life into the world, but the future doesn't belong to antinatalists. The future belongs to life lovers. And so as technology advances, I think prospective parents have a duty to load the genetic dice in favor of their future children and to choose genes, allelic combinations that predispose to high hedonic set points, extremely high pain tolerance, together with other things too. But for this podcast, let's focus on well-being.
And it's interesting because in a way there's two super simple ways of improving the quality of a sentient experience. One is to improve the environment around them and therefore the inputs that go into the entity. And the other one is to reconfigure the entity itself. And as you say, our technical ability to do the latter is, developing remarkably quickly.
Yes, I mean, it's really, although awareness of the hedonic treadmill, this negative feedback mechanisms in the CNS that stop us being very happy or so, it's more widespread. I think a lot of people still tend to regard it a bit like the second law of thermodynamics, just an unalterable feature of the world. But increasingly, it's going to be amenable to control. And essentially, the level of suffering in the world is going to become an adjustable parameter, and we have to choose which levels we think are optimal. Before tackling, the kind of the biological genetic basis of misery, essentially we've got to stop harming other sentient beings.
Yeah.
And so it is, in one sense, technically, it is extremely simple. We simply stop eating meat, animal agriculture, shut and outlaw the death factories.
Yeah.
But given human nature is the way it is, I think the most realistic hope of getting global veganism in our lifetime is the accelerated development and commercialization of cultured meat. Yeah, we can get the death factories shut and outlawed, and this I would see as a priority and feasible on a time scale that is easier to envisage than the idea of rewriting the vertebrate genome and so forth.
Yeah. And interestingly, on the animal farming front, I actually think that those alternatives will free people to upgrade their ethics. We'd love to be able to just, through the sheer force of ethical argument, persuade the whole world to go vegan, and we know how long that's likely to take. But actually, as the alternatives develop and become so prevalent and so easy and so direct, we'll find that people will end up going vegan without even having taken the conscious decision. And ironically, as they do that, it will free them to actually become ethical vegans after the fact, which is, I'd love it to be the other way around, but fine, I'll take it.
Absolutely. I think, the cultured meat revolution is going to lead to a moral revolution too. Yes. That as people who choose the cruelty-free cultured meat option will, in many cases, extremely morally indignant with people who don't. And rather than being generations, hundreds of years of holdouts. I think once the majority of the population they've made the transition, then outlawing factory farms and slaughterhouses will follow quite rapidly. Even now I think one can envisage enacting legislation perhaps that kicks in in a decade's time or so, that I want it to kick in tomorrow, essentially outlawing factory farms and slaughterhouses and mandating the use of cultured meat for people who want to eat meat.
And the next, I guess, ring of the moral circle has even more sentient beings in it than farmed animals, which is wild animals. And this is a controversial topic, even within vegan and animal advocacy movements, because many of the people in those groups still seem to have this sort of naturalistic fallacy that if suffering happens in the wild, it's somehow okay and we shouldn't intervene. Some of their nervousness about human intervention in the wild is understandable, because human hubris can do awful things. But the complexity and the challenges of intervening don't mean we should just exclude those beings from our moral consideration. We should be prudent and be cautious. But what's your sense of the future of wild animal suffering and how that might play out?
I don't think a few hundred years to now there will be suffering in nature. The first thing perhaps to stress is that humans already massively interfering with nature. So it's not a question of are we going to intervene or not. We are doing so on an absolutely massive scale.
Yeah, it's too late.
So the question is, what ethical principles, if any, should govern our interventions? And many people, more traditionally minded people, have this idea that, the best thing humans can do is essentially leave non-human animals in nature to be. But essentially, Darwinian life is not as presented in today's, kind of Disneyfied wildlife documentaries. Darwinian life is about starvation, parasitism, disease, and horror. Not all the time, but a lot of the time. Most non-human animals die of starvation at a very early age. Starving to death is extremely unpleasant, regardless of your a species. Countless non-human animals are disemboweled, asphyxiated, in some cases eaten alive, die in absolutely ghastly ways. But thanks to developments in biotechnology, genetic engineering, we can essentially choose whether we want a living world in which sentient beings harm each other, or a living world in which all sentient beings can flourish. Starting off, so the bedrock of any compassionate stewardship of nature, free living wild animals, is going to be cross-species fertility regulation, which in the case of large terrestrial vertebrates can be done by immunocontraception. In the case of small, fast breeders, one would do it via tunable synthetic gene drives. Gene drives essentially cheat the laws of Mendelian inheritance and allow one to spread desired versions of a particular gene or allele across entire populations. Initially, gene drives are going to be used to defeat vector-borne disease like malaria. In future, however, one could, for example, the SCN9A gene is the most common example I give. Dozens of different variants. Essentially, it's the volume knob of pain, and that if you have a benign version of SCN9A, you can still function to sort of avoiding noxious stimuli, but they're simply annoying rather than absolutely agonizing. One would start off with a little self-contained artificial biosphere, so it's not a case of embarking on uncontrolled experiments. But as well as cross-species fertility regulation, it's going to be necessary to tackle the problem of predation. Now, on a personal level, I would not be sad to have a living world without snakes, tigers, lions, and obligate predators. But most people, this is a sociological observation, are very keen on retaining so-called charismatic megafauna. But it is, if we want to, it's feasible to do so. Starting off, if you like, with something like catnip-laced cultured meat for lions or something like that, but also conducting essentially some light genetic engineering, converting obligate carnivores into herbivores, which triggers the response of, a lion who isn't actually chasing after and disemboweling zebras isn't truly a lion. This is the kind of species essentialism, to which I think generally appropriate response is, people who make the species essentialist argument generally do so wearing clothes, often using an iPhone or some other form of computing technology. It's essentially, humans who start wearing clothes, stop harming other humans and non-human animals, and embrace technology, don't cease to be human, and a lion can still be a lion if it isn't terrorizing a zebra.
And I think it's instructive to think about what is the ultimate motivation of that stance. And it's normally because of a human aesthetic appreciation for the wild. It's because we like watching the wildlife programs. We think nature is pretty. That's the motivation. But when you think about it from, yes, you need to think about it from the perspective of the lion, but you also need to think about it from the perspective of the antelope. And when you work that through and think about, okay, there are aesthetic considerations at the top of Maslow's hierarchy versus survival and being eaten alive, the moral calculus to me is pretty simple. There's a danger in any of these discussions that people will immediately jump on it and say, are you seriously considering, robotic beyond burger antelopes running around the wild so that the lions can eat them? That may seem outlandish, but I think the types of technologies you're talking about will render those things not outlandish, but almost more immediately, this type of thinking is already having an effect on how we engage with the wild today. And I think if you have a completely anthropocentric worldview, what tends to happen when you see a problem in the environment, whether it's overpopulation of deer or badgers with tuberculosis spreading it to farmed animals or some other perceived issue or invasive species or whatever humans have decided becomes a problem. If you have an anthropocentric worldview, the answer nearly always seems to be kill them all. Right? So that's the default answer. Whereas as soon as you say, no, we need a sentiocentric worldview where we actually take into account the fact that that badger or that deer has a moral salience in its own right because of its own experience and its own sentience, it doesn't give you a magical answer, but at least gives you the motivation to think about better answers. So, we are already, just in the UK and in Europe, seeing people going from just killing badgers to contraception, or for deer overpopulation, going from culling to managed contraception. And we're already starting to do really powerful research and actual interventions that have a much more compassionate edge to them. So I think while some people might, watch this video and go, you guys are crazy, well, yeah, maybe, but not for long, right? And just having that motivation, having that moral circle set broadly enough helps us find better answers, more compassionate answers.
Yes, I mean, once again, it helps if one thinks one's going to encounter that response, to start with the Bible and Isaiah, a few quotes from Buddha and the like, rather than plunging into high-tech transhumanism. I mean, also, I think realistically, this is only going to happen in the wake of the cultured meat revolution. That so long as humans are systematically abusing and killing non-humans, the idea that we're going to be systematically helping non-humans, compassionate stewardship of nature, is probably quite fanciful. But in the long run, despite being a super pessimist, I don't think we're going to retain the Darwinian horror show. It depends on ignorance, in that, as one sees from wildlife documentaries, on the occasions when they're sufficiently true to life, when a starving baby elephant or something like that is portrayed, that many viewers get indignant. Why did the cameraman keep filming rather than help? So we are going to enter into an era of kind of global panopticon in which every cubic meter is essentially accessible to inspection. We're not going to run out of computer power, shall we say. The pessimist thinks, well, this is going to be used for Orwellian purposes, but it can also be used for compassionate purposes. And it's worth, stressing that none of the technologies that we've touched on today, from genome editing to gene drives, depend on anything really, not kind of exotic sci-fi, the singularity, post-human superintelligence. It could be done with either today's technologies or recognizable extension of today's technologies.
And while I share your pessimism about the pace of social change and how deeply indoctrination holds us, because I think in a way we start as children with a baseline level of compassion and naturalism that then is largely trained out of us by parents and teachers and society and priests, which is frustrating. It's almost like we have to find a way back to that toddler mindset. So while I share that frustration with the pace of social change, I think there is a real thread of optimism around what our technological capability, as you've laid out. It's already enormously powerful. It's often just a question of will and application to really make radical improvements. But I think there's also a latent moral willingness to change that we can tap into using those technologies, because most people don't like causing suffering to any sentient being. Surveys show that even most meat eaters are against factory farming, and a surprising number would like to see slaughterhouses banned. As you say, even if it's restricted compassion for wild animals and so on, there is that sort of sense that most people just don't like suffering, which is good because suffering is a bad thing. So there's almost like a latent moral wave ready to go. There's a technological capability that could make that moral transition easy. And the measure of my success will be if in a few decades I can come back to you as an antinatalist and say, if you're happy that we continued and we carried on sentient existence, then maybe we've fulfilled some of the human potential and maybe some of the sort of David Deutschian optimism about our capability to do good.
Yes, it's there will be no point to antinatalism if all life by its very nature is enjoyable. That if we can phase out experience below hedonic zero, this whole kind of dark strain of suffering-focused ethics, negative utilitarianism, Buddhism will become redundant. But goodness knows, yeah, what a challenge.
We just need to go faster. Well, David, it's been brilliant to talk to you. Thank you so much. And I think just having these conversations and talking openly as you do about these ideas helps to normalize them and hopefully helps to just nudge humanity another tiny little mark towards a more moral, more accurate way of thinking. So thank you. What's the best way of people following you and keeping up with your work and learning about your thinking?
Well, headweb.com, hedweb.com is my motherlode website. And though its design is state-of-the-art late 20th century, nonetheless, essentially the core ideas, I continue to maintain the site. If you want to get more engaged, I'm as prone to use of social media as anyone. So the Hedonistic Imperative Facebook group, any of the issues that we've touched on in this discussion, please get in touch. Or Twitter. I'm Webmaster Dave on Twitter.
Brilliant. Well, David, you've been an inspiration to many, and me included. So thank you so much for joining the Sentientist Conversation.
Thank you, Jamie. Take care. Chat again soon. Bye-bye.
Yeah, you too.